here now, so I got right.
Here, take your script.
Where's Shepard? Where's Alan?
He's not here yet. Oh, Shepard's not here yet.
So we need to wait for him.
Yeah. We have to wait for him. Right now, half a minute behind schedule.
Everyone else is here.
Just him, eh? Who else we missing? Oh, yeah. I know what you mean. Yeah, and we shifted 8 minutes from you as well, so you can speak for 2 minutes. Okay, so don't forget, Peter, just when we finish, when you thank me, instead of calling up Captain Ricard, Jacqueline Book, you're calling up Social Heads off Jack Luck first. Yeah, so this is right after my presentation. So Vance, me, student presentation 1, Steve Shot.
In Italy? Okay. Welcome, and thank you for joining us at Western University's annual Remembrance Day service, organized and hosted by the University Students' Council. My name is Acting Sub-Lieutenant Peter Kermack. I'm a fourth-year social science student. I'm also a naval warfare officer at His Majesty's Canadian Ship Prevost, London's Naval Reserve Division, and I have the honor to act as your Master of Ceremonies today.
My name is Eugene Steve Shaw. I'm a third-year nursing student. It's a great honor to join Peter as your Masters of Ceremonies today. Before we begin, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for attending today. Whether online or in person, your presence speaks volume to your contributions and honor, as we remember and honor the sacrifices made by these brave soldiers, sailors, and aviators of past and ongoing conflict.
Now, we would like everyone to rise, if you're able, for the singing of our national anthem, performed by fourth-year music student Melosa Wang.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, our true north strong and free. From far and wide, O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God, keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Please be seated. Thank you, Melosa. I'd now like to call upon the USC Vice President University Affairs, Mariana Batista, to deliver a land acknowledgement today.
Remembrance Week is a time to join together to honor the fallen and pay tribute to those who have served and continue to serve the country. During this time, we acknowledge the countless sacrifices that have been made, and while it is important to acknowledge November 11th as Remembrance Day to show gratitude for the courage of our veterans and soldiers, I'd also like to take this opportunity to speak about Indigenous Veterans Day. Indigenous Veterans Day, which is observed every year on November 8th, is a day of recognition of the vital contributions of Indigenous peoples to Canada's military history, efforts that have for many years been overlooked and underappreciated. Indigenous peoples have a long history of military service in what we now call Canada. However, despite their courageous service, Indigenous veterans have historically been denied the same social and economic benefits afforded to their non-Indigenous counterparts and continue to face the disposition of their lands upon returning from war. So as we reflect on Remembrance Day today, it's essential that we simultaneously acknowledge these historical injustices so we can work towards reconciliation. You'll hear more later today about the history of Indigenous peoples in relation to their contributions to Canada's military efforts, and I encourage you to do your own research as well. With this, we acknowledge that Western University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Chinanton nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dishwith-One-Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors to our society.
Thank you, Mariana. I'd now like to call upon Dr. Alan Shepard, the President and Vice Chancellor of Western University, to deliver a speech on behalf of Western administration.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's an important ceremony for remembrance and recognition. For over a century now, people at Western have gathered each year to honor the men and women who have served our country to preserve the rights and freedoms we enjoy as Canadians. We also take this opportunity to pay tribute to those who continue to serve in Canada's military and peacekeeping efforts around the globe. Many who have served and some who have sacrificed their lives for us were Western students, staff, faculty, and alumni. We take pride in the vital contributions they have made collectively over decades. Ever since the First World War, where 620,000 Canadians fought and more than 60,000 perished, we've paused at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In the past century, over 1 million more Canadians have answered the call of duty in conflicts around the world, and tens of thousands have not come home. Their names appear in memorials erected in towns and cities from coast to coast to coast. One of those memorials is right here on campus. Many people don't know, and indeed I didn't know before today, that our famous tower, the Middlesex Memorial Tower of University College, was erected to honor soldiers from Middlesex County who died in the First World War. Their names are displayed in the main foyer. Each name on memorials like this across the country represents someone's son or daughter, a parent, a spouse, a sibling, a cousin, friend, or neighbor. And so we pause today to remember them and to express our gratitude for the sacrifices they've made on the behalf of all of us. I hope you'll take time today, Remembrance Day, to reflect, learn, and give thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Shepard. I'd now like to invite Jerry Dell from the Office of Indigenous Initiatives to talk about Indigenous contributions to the Canadian war history.
Thank you very much for being here today. As an Indigenous person, I should say newly Indigenous person, because I was 60 scoop. I was brought up not knowing about my past or where I was from or anything. And so I'm learning now through oral teachings, through academic teachings here at Western about Indigenous people. And interestingly, some of the things I learned concern conflict over the last 40,000 years that we've lived here, and the peaceful management normally of Turtle Island or North America, and of course, in the peaceful management is it costs, even with peace, it costs, and that's one thing we have to realize. The cost of war, because we go right into open conflict of dropping bombs. It costs. There's always a cost when you don't get along. Anyway, for today, I wrote a poem. There isn't too much Indigenous material in it because I'm still trying to sort that out where I can fit that into poetry. But I'm a fourth-year English student. I love poetry. And right now we're going through Wordsworth and Coleridge and all the greats, and this is not that. So I'm going to ask a question, where are we? And of course, this is a ponderance question. We can think, I know we're at the McKellar Room, but as a society, as a civilization, the question refers to where are we? Okay, lest we forget, where are we? Where are we? Where are we? Do we really see? Do we really see? For sure, we live in comfort and joy in the land of milk and honey. In far-off lands stricken with poverty and war, do we offer power or just money? Or is it only a token we offer that says, you're on your own? Sorry, I'm busy on my phone. E.T., will you call home? I'm caught up in my algorithm, which is infinite in length. I'm caught up in conspiracy theories of our infinite military strength. I'm trying to forget the white-hot hatred of World War graphic historicism. Can't we just all work together and have peaceful pluralism? Small wars start larger wars. Large wars bring us into contact. All wars are easy to start and hard to end. Today, we have alternate facts, hoaxes, also higher ed enemies, diversity hatred. So we should not boast. Can we heal our planetary wounds before they become greater? Before uranium is used? We will not know what comes later. So, where are we? When we're taking the moment of silence, pondering the silence of those who died in recent wars, World War I, World War II, and others. Are we listening to the echo of our past horrors? Will we remember, lest we forget this year? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jerry. I'd now like to call upon Emily Kalajian, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the University Students' Council at Western University, to deliver a speech on behalf of the Council and all undergraduate students.
Thank you so much, Peter. I want to first thank Peter and Steve so much for putting the time and the planning into this. The biggest thing that I can remark about the USC is how student-led we are, and I think for someone like Peter and someone like Steve to give back in this way, it just means so much, and that's who we're all about. I want to remark on the fact that, the age that I am now, I'm 22 years old. I think about the people who were overseas from the years 1914, 1918, and they were my age, and lost out on the opportunity to have an education like this, leaving so soon. As Dr. Shepard mentioned, there's a lot of veterans that came from Western University. And the privilege that we have every single day to put on programming and go to school and do these things is all because of the people who came before us. My history, although not Canadian, in the fact that my family has veterans in it, but back in the day, my great uncle was a general in the partisan army in Italy, and unfortunately was assassinated during his time there. But what ended up unfolding from that is my family was displaced and ended up coming to Canada. And growing up, a really important part of my upbringing was learning about not even just what happened for my own family, but knowing the connectedness that does exist between what happened there and what happened back at home. So through community outreach, my family continued to be involved in veteran affairs within the city of Windsor. And there's a huge community there that I've been having the privilege to get to know and get to learn so many amazing stories from. And I can just remark on, meeting people both on the Italian side. There's actually a memorial over there, which is so wonderful in memory of my uncle and the work that he put in, and being able to connect with people there and then also share those stories back at home. I think it's very full circle, and we're very lucky to have those people who sacrificed their lives for us. So I won't take any more of your time, but I do appreciate everyone coming here today. This turnout is really wonderful, and continue to remember the lives that were lost and the sacrifice that was put in the name of our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Now, please stand as you're able to for the playing of the last post performed by second-year music student Abby Bright, and please also remain for this moment of silence.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them. Please be seated.
The First World War ended 106 years ago today. At that time, people thought that they have seen the end of it. Of course, we now know it marked the beginning of a chaotic century. Throughout World War II, the Korean War, and many peacekeeping missions since then, we have been fortunate to live in Canada. We come here today to remember, mourn, and honor those soldiers, sailors, and aviators who gave their lives on our behalf. We also think about those Canadian Armed Forces veterans who may be among us today. By doing so, we show our gratitude for those who served and actively serve our country.
I'd now like to call upon Emily again to deliver In Flanders Fields by Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae.
In Flanders fields, the poppies blow, between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below, we are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up your quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch, be yours to hold it high, if ye break faith with us who die. We shall not sleep, through poppies grow, in Flanders fields.
Thank you, Emily. I'd now like to ask Dr. Jonathan Vance from the History Department at Western to deliver an educational speech on the topic of remembrance.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. At Remembrance Day, when we think about those who served and gave their lives in wartime, we tend to think about certain types of people. The pilot shot down in flames, the soldier who fell while attacking an objective, the sailor who went down with his ship. But for a few minutes this morning, I want you to think of other people who don't necessarily get remembered at this time of year. Agnes Forbes was a young woman from my hometown, Waterdown, Ontario. She was born there, she was raised there. In 1913, when she was 22, the same age as Emily, she left the village and went to White Plains, New York, home of one of North America's leading nursing schools. In 1913, she left White Plains as a graduate, a professional nurse. And the following year, she traveled there one last time to settle her half-sister, who was starting the nursing program as well. By this time, Agnes had begun working as a graduate nurse and was looking forward to a long and productive career in one of the most respected professions that was open to women at the time. But in August 1914, the First World War began. 2 years later, in August 1916, Agnes was commissioned into the Canadian Army Medical Corps as a nursing sister. And I say commissioned because it's significant. Canadian nurses were virtually alone in the First World War in that they held commissioned rank. They were officers. They outranked most of the patients they would treat. This was an acknowledgement of their professional status and the respected position that they held in society. But it was grueling, exhausting work, that broke, that broke the health of many women. In January 1917, after only 4 months nursing in a Canadian military hospital, Agnes spent a month there as a patient. Her condition was later diagnosed as jaundice and an inflamed gallbladder. 6 months later, she came down with severe pleurisy, an inflammation of the membrane surrounding the lung. The doctors who examined her concluded that the condition had been caused, or at the very least worsened, by her sleeping in damp tents night after night after night. Agnes spent another month in the hospital. When she didn't improve, the military decided to send her home to Canada for light duty. Eventually, she was diagnosed not only with pleurisy, but with pulmonary tuberculosis. And in October 1918, the Army decided that her health was not up to further service in the military. So she was discharged. The conclusion of her doctors was that she would have a permanent disability of 40%. In short, Agnes was not physically fit enough to resume her pre-war vocation. Indeed, it seems that she never worked again. She moved out to British Columbia to live with a married sister. With only her military pension to keep her going, she was dependent upon the charity of her family. In 1941, Agnes died of tuberculosis. She was only 55 years old. According to her Army records, her death was due to her military service during the First World War, even though that service had ended 25 years earlier. And on Remembrance Day, I think it's important to think of people like Agnes. Her name is on no war memorial. After all, she died over 20 years after her war ended. But the war killed her as much as it did the pilot, the soldier, the sailor. By 1918, it had taken her health, it then took her career, and eventually it took her life. So this year, I wear a poppy to honor people like Agnes Forbes, for whom the First World War never really ended. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vance. An idea that we wanted to start this year is to highlight Western students during our ceremony. From the music performances to this presentation section, Western University harbors students who have found passion in studying Canadian war history, having built some sort of personal connection, research, or experiences. I would now like to call up Steve Shaw and Nicole to present their unique trip to France and Belgium in 2022.
Thank you for the introduction, Peter. My name is Steve,
And I'm Nicole Damianidis.
and today we'll be presenting about our unique experience in Belgium and France in 2022. I'm a third-year nursing student,
And I'm an HBA student at IB.
and joining us, someone who could not join us today, was Sarah G., a third-year medical sciences student here at Western. Throughout our trip, we all didn't know that we were all going to end up at Western University together, but this special trip has been a unique part of our friendships for the years past. A little bit more about the BVP 2022, the Beaverbrook Vimy Prize. It's fully funded by the Vimy Foundation, a Canadian nonprofit that seeks to advance Canadian war history for youth. It consisted of a 2-week educational experience to France and Belgium to learn about Canadian war involvement. The students, over 16 of us from Canada, Britain, and France. Majority of us from Canada, from coast to coast. While we were there, we visited cemeteries, war memorials, formal battlegrounds, museums, and partook in ceremonies. It wasn't a glamorous trip. It was educational. It was somber. It was history. And while we were there, we learned a lot. We saw a lot, we learned a lot, and this is what we brought back. And now I'm really happy to present to you about what the Beaverbrook Vimy experience means to me. I have a series of photos here that I've titled The Pain of Many. Picture here is the Meningate Memorial in Ypres, Belgium, dedicated to soldiers who served with the Commonwealth troops, and with over 50,000 names commemorated on these walls. During the Beaverbrook Vimy Prize, we also learned about what was going on at the home front, the women's suffrage movement. When men had to move overseas, women took up positions in manufacturing and agriculture. This was a huge boost to the pre-existing suffrage movement at that time. And in 1916, Manitoba became the first province that allowed women to vote.
Additionally, during our trip, we talked about the indigenous participation in the world wars. And even though their country at that time did not respect them, many of them still paid the ultimate sacrifice and service to their country. Pictured here, famous marathon runner Tom Lombo, who served as a runner in the trenches. The runner was a very particular, dangerous position, having to run important messages between communication trenches and front lines. Pictured here, Private Frederick Lee, one of the only Chinese Canadians who served and died in World War I. Frederick Lee was no hero. He was a regular soldier, and yes, he did overcome racism to enlist, but at that time, the Canadian government dedicated an entire monument to him. To this day, his monument, it's not in the best shape. It's even used as a skate park by locals. And we really think to ourselves, who exactly are we commemorating, and why are we commemorating them? Is it tokenism, or is it remembrance? This gravestone right here, it belongs to one of many Chinese laborers who perished on the Western Front. For those who don't know, over 100,000 Chinese laborers served as battlefield cleaners in World War I, along with the Allied troops. They were shipped from China over the Pacific Ocean to Canada, across the Atlantic, and then to the Western Front, where they served in dangerous positions cleaning up the battlefields. Many of them eventually died from disease, enemy fire, and unexploded bombs. Buried here is just one of those individuals who paid their sacrifice to the war at that time. Pictured here, the Deep Fell Monument, dedicated to over 80,000 soldiers, mostly South African and British, who died at the Battle of the Somme. The statue here in the American National Cemetery at Normandy, the place where they filmed Saving Private Ryan. And here, a picture that I took inside the Cathedral of Saint-Nazaire, the largest French national cemetery, with over 40,000 French soldiers commemorated there. This is Langemarck German Cemetery. This mass grave here commemorates over 28,000 German soldiers. And finally, the Ring of Remembrance. Over 500,000 names inscribed on these panels from 40 nationalities, organized only by alphabetical order and not by rank. This panel shows to us how, this Beaverbrook Vimy experience showed me that it wasn't the general description of war that some of the media portrays to us. It's not about the glorious or how good our army was, how much people we killed, how good we were, how victorious we were in war. It told us about the pain of many, of not just Canadians, but from soldiers from all over the world who paid the ultimate sacrifice for their own respective countries. We were drawn into this conflict from the various ideologies and nationalisms at that time, and everyone who were inscribed on these monuments that I showed you, as well as the Ring of Remembrance, paid the ultimate sacrifice for their own countries. And this is why I appreciate the Beaverbrook Vimy Prize for what it is. Because again, it depicted to me the pain of many. I want to bring it back home now. A picture here is me in the cave system under Vimy. This cave system is where soldiers would have taken refuge in the world wars. And while I was there, I found an inscription from a Private McKee, who is from London, Ontario. And it amazes me to think that over 100 years ago, 100 years from his time, I would have driven by his house. I, from London, Ontario, was able to find something that he left behind over 100 years ago. And this picture here is me honoring the gravestone of a Captain George Clarence Glidden. Captain Glidden was the grand uncle of Rob Glidden, someone that I volunteered with at the Elgin Military Museum. Now, Rob Glidden himself partook on such a similar experience a couple years ago, and he wrote this book, and I was fortunate enough to be able to pay respects to Captain Glidden once again on behalf of my friend Rob. A little bit more about Captain Glidden. Captain Glidden was born in Wallacestown, Ontario. He went to the University of Toronto, and he did not complete his medical school training, but eventually was commissioned as a captain in the 10th Battalion. He died in action of septic shock, and in his diaries, it was very interesting to note that he served in close proximity to Sir John McCrae. What I wanted to say here it is, although I have no direct ancestors who fought in the First or Second World War, I have a special spiritual, and emotional connection to the city of London, Ontario, and the broader Western community here today. With that, I want to pass it off to Nicole now.
Thanks, Steve. I want to start off my presentation by saying I'm very honored to be here today to be able to reflect on my experience through the program. So as Steve mentioned, during the trip, we had the privilege to pay our respects across many different cemeteries and monuments. But what he didn't mention is that the 2 weeks abroad flew by. Before we knew it, we were on the airport waiting to go home. And when we were at the airport, the coordinators tasked us with writing a reflection about our experience. And I actually found this to be something very difficult because there's so many things that I wanted to write about and reflect on. But something that kept on coming to my head was our trip to the Vimy Memorial, and specifically the statue of Mother Canada. So if you don't know, Vimy Memorial is dedicated to all Canadians who served during World War I, but particularly those with unknown gravestones. And Mother Canada is there, mourning the loss of her children, the soldiers of Canada. Her face and body language show so much sadness and pain, which deeply evoked a lot of emotion in me when I was at the memorial. I felt like I felt her pain and loss of the Canadian soldiers that day, and it made me feel very sad. But one thing it also made me feel was extremely connected to my Canadian identity and instilled a deep pride to be Canadian, knowing that all the Canadian soldiers before me gave up their life defending this privilege. So during our trip, we also had the experience of commemorating a soldier. I chose to remember Private George Kellen Caldwell of the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles. He was born in my hometown of Richmond Hill, Ontario, and actually lived by the church where I used to go after school for math classes. So I decided to honor him to our group when we were there and share his story, and it really sticks as a top moment for me. That being said, I'd like to do the same with someone from our local community because there are so many Western students who we've mentioned have lost their lives in World War I and World War II. Today, I chose to remember Lieutenant Dalton Gilbert Knox Garrett. He was a graduate of the medical department at Western and lived as a physician and surgeon in London and then later Winnipeg with his wife and 2 daughters. He was later transferred in 1918 to the Royal Army Medical Corps and was an attendee in the 133rd Field Ambulance Division. Sadly, he was killed in action during the 100 Days Offensive, only 6 months after his brother also passed away in action. He's laid to rest in Péronne, France, which is actually somewhere Steve and I got to visit, this cemetery specifically where he was rested, and he will be remembered today and always by the Western community. Thank you for letting me share his story, and I hope you can all take away from my presentation that on this day, we are always all able to find a connection to the world wars and to those who continue to give their lives for Canadians. And I'd like to also end off this presentation by saying that if you know anyone who's in grade 10, have any siblings or cousins, we highly recommend that you direct them to the Vimy Foundation website and so they can apply for this experience, because I can speak for myself, but I know Steve also feels the same way, that these 2 weeks abroad really changed our lives and really made us feel connected to our identity as Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve and Nicole. I would now like to call upon the social science head soft, Jack Luck, for his personal story about a relative that served.
Remembrance Day has always been a very meaningful time for myself and my family. It is a day for us to reflect upon the proud history of service of the generations of family members who have come before us, serving in all 3 branches of the Canadian Armed Forces. In particular, I find myself thinking about the service of my great-grandfather during the First World War. Private Alfred Joseph Digby served in Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 3rd Canadian Division of the Canadian Expeditionary Force from 1916 until the end of the war in 1918. Now, on his enlistment papers, his documented age is 18. However, being born on Halloween in the year 1900, my great-grandfather lied about his age to join the Canadian Expeditionary Force just shy of his 16th birthday. Now, I don't know about you, But at 16 years old, I had just gotten my driver's license. I was about halfway through high school and just starting to think about what I wanted to do with my life. I cannot even begin to imagine at that age, or even the age I am today, going off to war, living through the horrific scenes on the front lines, and experiencing firsthand the atrocities of one of history's deadliest conflicts. One of my great-grandfather's first engagements after arriving in Europe was the Battle of the Somme, one of the bloodiest battles of the war. He and his unit also fought in the Second Battle of Ypres, at Vimy Ridge, in the Battle of Passchendaele, and the Second Battle of Arras. Now, I'm sure as he was traveling across the Atlantic aboard some big ship, he hadn't come to realize exactly what he was walking into. Like most of the other young men going off to fight in the war, he thought it would be some grand adventure, an opportunity he otherwise would not have had to see Europe. I'm sure he also didn't realize that the Europe he was about to see was so dark, and the grand journey upon which he was about to embark would be so traumatic and deadly. Or perhaps how his actions would be so heroic and his story so inspirational generations later. What inspires me the most about my great-grandfather's story is his perseverance and courage to go on once he found himself in the midst of war at such a young age. To go on through bloody battle after bloody battle, through being hospitalized for weeks due to severe trench foot and scarlet fever, through suffering a gunshot wound to the upper left thigh during the Second Battle of Arras, which would ultimately lead to his discharge and return home to his family. Like so many others, he gave up his youth to serve king and country, to fight for the values and freedoms which we hold so dear, to create the Canada we know today. That is something that I will always remember and forever be grateful for. Over the years, as I've continued to research and learn about my great-grandfather's story, I have developed a more fulsome appreciation for his service, and in turn the service of all of the other brave Canadians who have taken up the call to serve their country over the years. This Remembrance Day, I reflect upon and remember my great-grandfather, my great-uncles and other family members, and all of the brave women and men in uniform who have served, continue to serve, and have sacrificed so much for our country, and for me to be able to stand in front of you all today and share my great-grandfather's incredible story. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I'd now like to call upon Captain Retired Jacqueline Book as this year's Veterans Guest Speaker to deliver her speech.
Good morning. As we gather to remember and pay tribute to our veterans, I'm humbled to stand before you as a veteran and faculty member. Today, our country honors those who have served, both past and present, in times of war, military conflict, and peace, to keep us safe, defend our freedoms, and protect the values that unite us as Canadians. Not long after I graduated from Western University from the aviation program, I enrolled to become a soldier and officer in the Royal Canadian Air Force as a pilot. At that time, war and conflict seemed distant. However, that quickly changed. My comrades and I quickly learned the costs of the freedoms we as Canadians experience here in Canada. Our first flight as trained pilots was what we call a unit checkout. The second was in theater in Southwest Asia. 40,000 members of our Canadian Armed Forces served in the Afghan mission between 2001 and 2014. Some of you may have gathered along the section of highway between CFB Trenton and the coroner's office in Toronto following the repatriation of a fallen soldier. It was incredible as a soldier, as a nation, to see first responders and then citizens gathered on the bridges along what we now know to be the Highway of Heroes. The Afghan conflict was the first time in Canadian history soldiers were repatriated back to Canadian soil. Their legacy, along with all those before them, is now being remembered by 2 million trees being planted along the highway, one for each Canadian who has volunteered for service, including the 117,000 fallen soldiers since 1812. I stand here today as a reminder that my story is one of only thousands, and to honor the voices for those who did not live for the opportunity to share their stories. During my 4 tours in Afghanistan, I carried out 136 combat missions and repatriated 13 of our 159 fallen soldiers who were brought home. So many mothers, fathers, sons and daughters, sisters and brothers never returned home to their families. Their parents were left with only memories and the glory of being awarded a Silver Cross, something only the parent of a soldier can comprehend. Today, as we thank our veterans, make sure to thank their families as well. It was their loved ones who stayed home to carry the unknown burden of the possibility of living without them by their side. I remember in the early days of the Afghan conflict, when rockets were launched into our camp in Kandahar, we would all scurry to the bunkers and wait for the all clear. In my later deployments, we were so tired, we stayed in our tents with our flak vests on, C7 rifles under our cots, and waited for the sound of the tornado bombers to depart, quickly by the sound of them offloading over the mountains, where most of these trajectories came from. Often, we would be attacked as many as 8 times per night, but the mission still carried on. Soldiers needed to be transported the following sunrise, and hospitals needed to be resupplied and evacuated to make room for incoming wounded. It's hard for many Canadians to grasp what freedoms are at stake, as most citizens have never personally experienced what it is our soldiers are so vigorously protecting, the freedoms we can only hope our children will benefit from. Nor will most ever learn to comprehend the ultimate sacrifice many soldiers have made for our country. To all those that have served and who will serve in the future, you have my deepest respect and profound gratitude. The honor of serving in the RCAF and wearing the Canadian flag brings with it a sense of duty, privilege, and above all, great pride. To pause and acknowledge the impact and celebrate the country we are today is a privilege unlike any other. For those of you interested in serving our country, I thank you. There are no greater bonds you will make in your life than those with whom you serve. I'll close with a quote from Agnes MacPhail. Patriotism is not dying for one's country, but living for one's country. This should be a reminder to all of us to remember those who have sacrificed and to live every one of our days to its utmost potential, lest we forget.
Thank you, Captain Book. As we wrap up this ceremony, I'd like to thank Western Administration, the History Department, and the countless student volunteers and student leaders who put this all together.
I also like to thank again all the Canadian Armed Forces members, both past and present, who are with us today, both in person and online. We thank you for your service, and we appreciate all that you do for this country. As this ceremony comes to a conclusion, I'd like you all to continue to keep the thoughts of the brave soldiers, sailors, and aviators who gave their lives defending this nation we call home. Not just today, but every day. Our modern-day nation is built through their contributions, and only through the study of history can our future generations avoid the same mistakes. Words cannot begin to describe my own personal gratitude for the brave individuals who paid the ultimate sacrifice. Before we conclude today's service, I pose to you the question to reflect on throughout the day. What do you remember? Thank you.